Hey friends, this is the Great Sultini and I'm super excited to announce animation with Svelte. So let's get started. So let's talk about animations being beyond whimsy. So there's a lack of reverence for both animation and accessibility where they're treated as nice to have instead of being part of a holistic user experience. But it's not because we don't care, right? But it's been historically hard. None of us intend to create a bad user experience on purpose. Animations can tell stories and help the user not feel disoriented if elements on the page reflect how objects behave in the real world instead of teleporting around, right? And it can also help bring attention to parts of the site that require it. To understand how animation in Svelte are first-class citizen, we have to go back in history. And Svelte was forged by Rich Harris in a newsroom for that purpose and is popularly used for, but not limited for, visual storytelling and data visualizations since then. So get the popcorn out because we're going to watch a movie. So Svelte is used where Rich Harris worked at the New York Times, right? So let me just play this for you.
Speaking of the Olympics and all the different visualization work that you've done, what have you enjoyed building the most?
The most recent project was a project around the Olympics. News organizations in the US are not permitted to use any video footage from the games at all because the rights are exclusively held by NBC. And yet we want to be able to tell people the results of the races, obviously, because people rely on news organizations like us to know who just won the 100 meters. And so we have a choice. We can either describe what happened or we can find a new way to show it. And what we settled on was a data visualization which looks like the race is happening in animated form in the context of a video that appears inside a tweet or inside an Instagram story. And so what we built was an app for generating these videos based on data that came from the live feed from the Olympics.
And you've heard it from the leader of our church. So let's continue. First, we're going to look at some basic example, but before I start with that, remember the code is available on GitHub and you can open the examples on StackBlitz to play around with them. And I hope you're ready to become an animation wizard and delight your users. So let's start with basic transitions. A transition is triggered by an element entering or leaving the page as a result of a state change. And Svelte exposes 7 transition functions which are fade, blur, fly, slide, scale, draw, and crossfade. And we can look at the video here. And you can use the same intro and outro transition. For example, transition fade, but if you want to use a different intro and outro, you can use in and specify your transition there, and the same thing for the out. So we're going to here have some text, and if I open this example, I can go to fade, and let's just import the transition, right? So just how I have it in this example, we can say import fade from Svelte transition, and then we can use the transition. Transition fade. Let me just save this, and then if I go here, and if I enable it again, it's going to animate in and animate out. So transitions don't play on first render unless you set intro to true for Svelte components, but since I'm using SvelteKit, you can't do that, but you can do that on mount if you want to play the transition when it mounts. Because of that, I'm using this trick where I'm setting animate to false, and then when the component is ready, we're just going to flip it using this checkbox, and then we're going to animate it in. And I also made a specialized component here that's going to give me also a replay feature, so I don't have to do this all the time, which you're going to see. One thing worth mentioning is that transition functions accept at least delay, duration, and easing parameters, but they might accept others, which you can find in the documentation. You can specify a custom easing function or use a built-in Svelte easing function to give character to your animation, which you're going to see in a bit. And you can use the ease visualizer to help you explore different easing options. So if I go here, you can see around you have all these transitions here, and you can pick one and then you can play it or you can restart it. But yeah, you can play around with this and you're going to see it's really awesome. So you understand. One of my favorites are quint and quart probably. But yeah, let me just close this. And for the next example, we're going to see how we can animate this text. So this is going to be a bit more advanced. Let me just close this. And this is the end result we're going to get. So I just want to show you something more interesting. So in this example, I want to split up and animate some text, which is simple using a declarative JavaScript framework like Svelte, because it doesn't require a library. So we can just split the text and loop over the characters or loop over individual words. First, I'm going to declare the lines and use empty lines to create a pause between other tags that's going to animate in, which is a neat trick. And then I'm going to use some transitions and an easing function as we discussed it right now. And I'm also going to show you how you can create a stagger effect. And I also want the text to appear from the bottom of the element instead of fading in. So I just set an overflow hidden on the parent. So if I go here to the example, let me just open fly. I have a custom animate component, so I don't have to do the shenanigans with the label and checkmark. Basically, so here I define my lines, so I have some lines, and I'm using an empty one so I can create a dramatic pause, right? So we can just import fly from Svelte transition, and then I also want back out from Svelte easing, and then we can just use the animation as shown here. So we're just looping over the lines, right? And this is really easy in a declarative JavaScript framework, so you don't have to use some other library. And yeah, now we can go to our span where our lines are, right? And then we can just start enter transition fly, and then we can give it some parameters. We can say appear below, and then we can stagger it. So I'm going to show you what it means. So I can say back out, and let's first animate this in. So if I do this, you can see it does this, but I want the words to appear one after another, right? I mean, this is an all right effect, but we can do so much better. Staggering is simple as specifying a delay. We can say 300 milliseconds, and then we're going to multiply it by the index that we get from the loop. And now I can save this, and now we can get some awesome animation. And how sweet is that? And you can do whatever you want. This can be some marketing, right, or whatever, and I think this is really cool. So yeah, so let's go through another separate stagger effect, so I can just drill how awesome this is. So if I go to stagger, see stagger, and yeah, let me just repeat this. So this is another awesome trick when you're like looping over some items for demos. You can just say length and specify the items, and then you can just loop over them. But yeah, let's do the same trick. So we can say import fade from Svelte transition, right? And then we can go here. Let's just give it space, and then we can say in fade, and let's just give it a duration. Let's say 1 second, and then we can say delay 300 milliseconds times 1. We can save it, and we can see the boxes are animating now staggered, which is really cool for some cards. But if you have a lot of cards, it might be also wise to use an intersection observer, so you only animate the ones that are coming into view, because if you have 100 of them, then it's going to have a weird effect, right? But look how cool this is. Here I also mentioned that if you use something like transition fly, the transition would play in reverse when it's unmounted or the component gets deleted, right? Yeet the component. But if you use an intro like in fly, you can use an outro that's a different or the same one if you want, and it doesn't have to be the same, right? And if you don't know what mount and unmount means, it just refers to when the component gets created and destroyed. Another awesome thing about transition events is that you can have these listeners, so you can listen for when the transition starts, when the outro starts, and when they're finished, right? And I'm going to show you some fun examples later how I use this. I also want to mention that some of the transitions are specific to certain things, like using draw for animating the stroke of an SVG elements, and I'm going to show you an example in a second. So this is basically how you can animate an SVG of a circle with a check mark in Svelte to give that delightful interaction. So we just need to import draw, and then we can just use this to animate the stroke. And I have these examples here. If I go to the ones that we've seen previously, here I have an SVG. So let me just close this. I can go to examples, and if we go to the SVG here it is. So here's the path, and I'm just using in draw duration 1.5 seconds, and then I'm delaying the other one for 500 milliseconds, right? So if I refresh, we can see how it draws in, and that's really cool and how simple it is to do in Svelte. So let's talk about something useful you should know, and those are local transitions. You might encounter an undesired effect when your parent element transition plays, causing the children element transition to also play. So if I go to an example here, let me just, for example, if I add 2 more items, and then for example if I unmount the parent component, what's going to happen is the children are also going to animate. So if I go here, just see local, and if I go to the animations here, we can see that I have a transition slide on the child when you add it. So this is the slide, and then it's just going to fade for the parent. But watch what happens when you unmount the parent. Those child elements get animated, and you might not want that, so we're going to look into how local transitions can help us solve that problem. And local transitions only play when the block they belong to is created or destroyed, and don't get triggered when parent blocks are created or destroyed. So you're not going to encounter this problem often, but when you do, it's useful to know about it, and it's easily solved by just adding the local modifier to your transition. Like here, you don't have to import anything, and we can just fix this like here. So we can go to the slide, and we can say local, save. And now when I add more children, it's going to animate as usual, but now when I remove the parent, it's not going to play the transition. And you're going to often run into this problem with page transitions and etc. So you're going to know how to solve it, which is awesome. Another useful thing to know about are key blocks. Sometimes you want to play a transition whenever a value changes, and the key block exists for that purpose, as key blocks destroy and recreate their contents when the value changes. So in this example, we want to update the notification, and each time we get a new notification, we really want to animate the text, or you can even animate the bell or whatever else you want. So you're going to get this nice animation. If I go here to that example, we're going to see I have a set timeout, so I can see it's right here. I go transition skip. Nothing special, I just have a set timeout. It increments the notification just for the demo. And we're going to learn how we can easily animate this using key blocks. So if I go here, we're just going to first import the animation. So we can say import scale from Svelte transition. And here we have the notifications, right? You don't have to touch anything else. And now the trick for this is to replay the transition each time the value gets updated. So we can do that by using a key block. We're going to use that value that always changes, which is notifications. And then we're going to close the key block. And of course, let's give it the animation in scale, because if we don't have it here, this is what's going to happen. So if I go here, just restart this, and it's just going to increment, but nothing special is going to happen. But now we want to replay that animation, which is possible thanks to the key block. So if we can see, it's animating, and how cool is that? So let's talk about page transitions. Because SvelteKit is the default way to build Svelte apps, you might want to know how to do page transitions, and it's a great way to use what you learned so far. So if you notice so far, I already have page transitions. Really don't emulate this. This really isn't some slide deck or whatever. I just created a component where I'm using arrow keys to navigate around. So you can see I get this really cool page transition. But yeah, let me just show you quickly how I've done this. I created a transition component. You can put this anywhere you want. I just put it in lib. And how it works is, so you have the whatever transition you want. I'm going to use slide. So I get this cool slide effect, right? I'm going to give it a key, which we just learned about right now. And I'm going to also pass it a duration, so I can set it from the outside. And then we're going to use the key block to restart the transition, right, which we just learned about. And then for the delay, we're going to pass it a duration. Otherwise, we're going to get some weird effects because it's going to overlap. So if I go here, yeah, you see how weird it is because there's no delay. And then we're going to pass in a slot, so whatever it is after this is going to be displayed inside here. And then this is optional, but you can specify position absolute and you can spread it 100% width and height, right? And this is if you're using something like slide, because you're going to have weird transitions. If I, for example, comment out this style, you're going to see it looks weird, right? So you can just give it a position absolute if you experience this problem, and it's going to be great. So another thing you have to do when you create your transition component, you have to somehow get what changed, and that's the URL path name. And in the past, I used the one from the Svelte store or the SvelteKit store, but there's something weird going on with that and it doesn't give me the results I want. So what I found is that you can create a layout TS in your source routes, and then you can just get the URL here and you can pass it the URL path name, and now you can use it in your layout. So if you go to layout, source routes, and we just import the type page data, the page transition, which I just showed you now. And then you can just wrap this entire thing here. So you can use the page transition, give it the key data URL, specify the duration, and then you can pass anything you want after that. And that's how simple page transitions in SvelteKit are. So let's talk about custom transitions. The transitions you've seen so far cover most of what you need, but sometimes you want to combine them or do something crazy, and that's where custom transitions come in. You might be thinking how Svelte being a compiler means there's some magic involved with transitions, but surprisingly, transitions use regular CSS with the help of JavaScript. So you can see how Svelte itself implements something like fade. If we go here to the source code, right? But let me just close this because I have it in the post. So you can see it's just a function and it has a similar signature to Svelte actions. And it's just a regular function, right? Fade, it takes a node, it's just an element. It has some options and then it gets the styles from the node. It gets opacity and it returns delay, duration, easing, and a CSS function that generates the keyframes for the animation. And we're going to learn what exactly this means when we create our own custom transition. As I mentioned, Svelte transitions use CSS instead of JavaScript so they don't cause jank because they can run separately and not block the main thread. And next we're going to work on the best model ever. I hope you like that. So I have a simple model I want to spice up when a user opens it by scaling and transforming it. So we're going to create a custom transition for it. So for this I created a custom transition function model that's going to take the element and parameters, and we're going to get the existing transform and return a CSS function. And we're going to see how the CSS function takes a t argument that's a value between 0 and 1 with an easing function applied after, and then the u argument is really the opposite. And I'm going to explain more what this means because just saying it out loud is really confusing, right? So I'm going to use it to scale and translate the y of the element so it starts to grow from negative 100 pixel. But yeah, let's really look how we can do that. So if I go here, nothing happens because we haven't done anything, right? So we can go to custom CSS. Let me just see. Here we can open this and let's open the model. So inside the page, I have nothing special. I just have some audio that's different from the post to make it more fun. And then I just have a model that I gave the image to. Yeah, so we can go to the model itself here. And as I showed you in the post, we can just create the custom event. So I'm going to show you how you can do that. And then we can import a transition, quint out, from Svelte easing. And let's also import the type. If you're not using TypeScript, it's fine. You can just ignore types. So we can say transition config from Svelte transition. So let's just create some types so it's easier to read. We can say modal params. It's going to have a duration, right? Going to be a number. And let's create the type for the model itself. We're going to have a node. As we've seen, it's an element. Params, which are going to be optional. So let's use modal params. And then it's going to return a transition config. So let's create our custom function, and it's really nothing scary. So I can say const model. Let's give it the model type since we created it. And then we're going to pass it node, and then the parameters, which we're going to set 300. And let's initialize it as empty since it's optional. But yeah, we can turn it. Now we can get the transform from the styles. So we can say const transform. And you get it by using getComputerStyle. And this isn't really Svelte or anything, right? This is just regular JavaScript. So you can use that node, and we can get the transform properties. You can see you can get many other properties because it's really just regular JavaScript, yeah. So you can say transform, and then we can return duration that we pass in easing. So you can use quint out. And here is the most important part where we use the CSS functions. So you can get t and u, and then we can return a string that's going to be our CSS, right? So we can say, for example, transform, and then we're going to pass it if it already has existing transforms. That's why we did that. So we can say for scale t, I'm going to say translate y, and then we can say u times, since we want it to be negative 100, then we're going to give it a percentage. And this is wrong, so I need to update this. Yeah, and let's see what else. Oh, I should also probably make this valid, right? I think this is it. Let me just see. So we can just give it also a transition. So let's recap. We created this custom transition, and t and u might sound complicated, but I'm going to explain it in a bit, so you understand more how it works. I also have some fun additions here that I didn't include in the post because you can really hear the audio. So you can say transition model, and now we can pass it a property. So it's 1 second, and it's going to pass to our custom CSS function. And then when we save that, if you're using this anywhere else, you would just import the model, right? And then you can use it. So nothing here is specific to what you're doing, but the model itself. So when I go here, now our model should work. How awesome it is. The easiest way to think about t is that it animates to the value you specified, and u animates from the value you specified. And I'm going to show you this quickly in Excalibur. So for example, let's say that you have a box, and the box is going to travel 100, whatever. So for example, you have this, you just draw t here, and here is going to be u. And let's say the distance is 100 pixels. So if you want this box to travel to what we used here, we used -100. Yeah, okay. So let's pretend we want to animate this from minus 100 pixels on Y, right? Or X in this case. It's going to go like this. And this is when we use U. So we can say from this value is going to animate here. But if we use T here for translate Y, it would go the opposite direction, right? So since we use Y, it would go like this, when basically you want to animate it from this direction up. This is really confusing if you just read the documentation on this, but I hope my explanation makes a lot more sense. The Svelte documentation advises to use CSS when possible as a return function because of performance reasons, and CSS is just going to generate the keyframes, right? So this is why Svelte is awesome for animation. It doesn't use JavaScript and it blocks the main thread, causing janky animations. But if you want to do something more ambitious like a typewriter effect, using JavaScript you can return a tick function. Instead, it's going to use the JavaScript during the transition with the same argument. So we're going to create something like this, which is really awesome. As I have it here, right now it's nothing special. We don't even have a transition. Let me just open this example so I can go custom JS. And also here I have some sounds I didn't include in the post. But yeah, let's just create a custom typewriter effect. So let's see what we need. As you can see, this is just a regular component, nothing special. I just have a background here, and here's some fun additions I made, right? Yeah, so let me just import first the type, transition config from Svelte transition. So this is going to be great. Let me just put it here. And then let's create the types again like before. And if you don't care about TypeScript, you don't need this, right? Typewriter params. We're going to give it a speed, and I yeeted this from the Svelte examples because math is hard, right? Typewriter, say that 10 times, right? So you can give it node, which is again an element, params which are going to be optional. We're going to use typewriter params. It's going to return transition config that we just imported, so we can save this. And yeah, basically that's the boring TypeScript out of the way. So let's do the fun part. Or if you don't like math, this isn't going to be fun, but yeah. So let's create a custom animation typewriter. We're going to give it the type we created just now. So we're going to pass it the node, speed at 1, and we're going to initialize it as empty in case it doesn't exist. So let's do that. And then we're going to set for the text for the node text content. If it doesn't have any, oh again, I made the same mistake here. If it doesn't have any, see, that's really awesome. Completion, boom, done. So we're going to pass it as empty if it doesn't have any text content. So we're going to set the duration to the text length, and don't ask me about this math. All right. So you can say speed times 0.1, and you can change this if you want. And let me also just make sure it does the multiplication first. And then we're also going to return the same as we did before, right? So we can say duration, and let me just see. Yeah, I think I also forgot here. So you can pass it tick instead. So we're going to use JavaScript, and for each tick is going to do this calculation. So again, we're using T because we want to animate 2. And then we can get I as the character, so you can truncate it. Say math trunc text length times T. And then we can say node text content, and we can just slice it for each one, right? Using the index or the current character, right? That's presented by I. And that's pretty much it, the typewriter effect, right? You don't really have to understand the math, just that it's cool. And now you can export this function and use it on whatever element you want. But yeah, here I have some on intro and intro end, which isn't important. So I can just say in, and now we can use typewriter. And let me just see if this is everything. Okay, so now when I save this, it should do the typewriter effect, but it should also play the typewriter sound effect. Okay, so moment of truth, let's save. Beautiful. Next, we're going to learn about deferred transitions. Deferred transitions are awesome when you want to choreograph elements changing position from one parent to another to create an illusion how objects behave in the real world instead of disappearing and reappearing. And we can see in this example how this works. So for example, you have a parent A and a parent B, and you want to send this item between each other. So let me just show you in this example I have here. So this is just going to be lame, right? Because when we change the container, nothing special happens. I just have some randomized function and that's it. But sad noises, right? So basically we can use deferred transitions to animate that. So we can send and receive the items using crossfade that Svelte provides. And here I show you that in this diagram. So the crossfade function creates a pair of transitions called send and receive. when an element is sent, it looks for a corresponding element being received and creates a transition that animates the element to that position. This might sound complicated, but the only thing you have to know is import crossfade and then give Svelte the unique identifier, and that's it. So the reverse happens when it's received. If there is nothing to animate, we can also use a fallback, and you can set options for crossfade, including delay, duration, transition, easing, and fallback. So we're going to get this nice transition instead. And how magical is that? So let's do that. If I go here to Deferred, I'm just going to open it here. And here you can see it's nothing special, just have emojis. I randomize it using the shuffle function, and then I swap the container each time I press this button, and then I have a simple remove feature and a reset one. And really nothing special, just simple, right? So let's see how we can introduce a crossfade here. So first I'm going to import crossfade from Svelte transition, and then I'm going to import quint out from Svelte easing, thank you TypeScript. And then we're going to create the crossfade, which might sound complicated at first, but it's really nothing bad. So for example, it's simple as this for now. We can say send receive, and we can say crossfade, and let's just pass it empty params because it's going to complain. And that's basically it for now. We can go back to this in a second. So now how do we use it? We can go to our animation, right? And then I have it here after the class. So we can say in receive, we're just going to give it a special key that's going to be the emoji, and then we're going to say out send, again special key emoji, and let me just copy this over, and we're going to do the same for the other parent because it needs to know what it sends and receives, and it's really magical. So we can do this, and now if I save it, if I go to example, it should work, right? So if I go to this, oh, how awesome is that? This is just incredible. I could do this all day. There's another thing that we can do to set as the fallback. So for example, now when we delete the items, it just, nothing happens, right? So let me just reset this. And here's how you can provide the fallback. So if I go here, this is the spooky part, right? It looks similar like the custom transitions we did, so no problem. And we can set the duration right for that property, and we give it a fallback function that also accepts a node, right? Then we can say const style, again, get computed style node, and then we can see if it has any transform. So if it has a transform none, then we're going to return an empty string. Otherwise, we're going to use the transform from the style. And this is also an example from the docs, I believe. And then we're going to return again the duration. This is the fallback. So this duration here is for the crossfade itself, but here is the fallback when there is no crossfade happening, right? So you can say easing quint out, and you can pass it a CSS function, and I called it time, but you can just name it t. And then we're going to return a string, going to be opacity t, right? And then transform, let me just see, transform, right? And then we're going to have the scale. It's going to take the time. And I should also wrap this since it's CSS, right? And then let's give it, I called it t here. And maybe we should also do it here. So we can save this, and let's see what happens now. So remember, here we have the duration now that's going to take when these items change position. But now when I remove an item, it's going to fade out. So also briefly want to mention that this is one of the most magical features of Svelte, at least to me, and it works great for elements that change position as long as you're not rotating the elements, because rotations are, for example, the absolute pure evil for some reason. So let's talk about Svelte Animate. You can use the Svelte Animate directive to trigger an animation when the contents of an each block changes using an existing Svelte animation function such as flip, or you can specify a custom animation function. And if you didn't know, the flip animation technique is great when you have items that change position and want to show that transition, and lets you do impossible CSS animations while being performant. So basically the flip animation stands for first, last, invert, play. As you can see, for example, if you have this element in the first position and then it goes to the last position, then it's going to invert it to the first position, so it pretends it never animated to this one, and then it's going to play it. But you might be thinking this looks like ridiculously simple, right? But for example, let's say you have two containers. How would you do that using CSS? You can't, right? And this is where you can use the flip technique. So for example, imagine if this was the first container and the second container, you could create the illusion that that item is transferring or animating over to that other container. You just need to calculate the values in advance, and you don't have to do any fancy math. and then you just do the difference and then you animate it. And basically, in the context of this example, in the previous example, if you remove an element, it just leaves an empty space. So if I go here, let me just reset this. Nothing happens here, right? Yeah, so we can go here to this example that I have separately. So again, right, same as before, nothing happens. We can make this a lot better. So how do we do this? And believe it or not, all of this that I said so far might sound super complicated and etc., but this literally in Svelte requires one line of code if you ignore the import, right? So let me just go to that other example. I named it Animate Flip, right? So let's just be consistent so I don't change the files here. Let me say Animate Flip. And this is the same example, right, as we have here. So how do we do that in Svelte? And all that you have to do, so you can go here, you can import flip from Svelte, animate, and now you have to use it in your animation. So if I go here, let me just find it. Yeah, we can just say animate, flip, and we can also specify it for the other container. You can go here, animate, flip. And do you believe it when I say that this is everything you have to do? And let's just look at here. I'm going to save it now. And look what happens when you remove an item now. The elements around it are going to react to it instead of just being an empty spot and then everything shifts. So look when I delete this. How magical is this? And everything works the same as before. And now pay attention when I add the items back in, they're going to also react. How awesome is this? One thing worth mentioning is that having flip inside Svelte is amazing, but it's limited to an each block, and later I'm going to show you an example of using flip with another animation library that is going to blow your mind. Let's talk about another awesome feature of Svelte, and that is motion. Svelte exposes two writable stores, tween and spring, that are useful for values that change over time. We take for granted how the browser can interpolate values of an element such as opacity going from 1 to 0, right? We just need to specify transition and don't think about it. But the browser have to smoothly interpolate those values by creating intermediate values from 1, 0, 1, 0, 2, and etc. all the way up to 1. Unfortunately, you can't tap into this power for values outside of CSS, but lucky for us, Svelte provides you with a way to interpolate between numbers, arrays, and objects of the same shape. You can also pass many different options, delay, duration, easing, and etc. And you can also use other interpolate functions such as defree interpolate. If you're into that, to smoothly interpolate between two colors, among other things. You know, you're thinking I can already do that in CSS, but the difference here is that you can do it outside of CSS, right, where you need it. So you can create a HSL color spectrum or whatever you want. So use tween when you need a smooth transition between two values. So let's look at the next example. If I go to motion tween, here I have a Pokemon simulator. It just has a set timeout that's going to subtract the health from the Pokemon. And this looks cool, right? But what if that was like animated, right? So we need some kind of tween between the values, right? And it's only going to take one line of code. So for example, if I go here to tween, let me just find it, motion tween, you can see here is a simple component, current HP, takes the Pokemon HP, here's a timer, and really nothing special. That's it. So let's see how simple this is in Svelte. The only thing we need to do is import tweened. So you can say import tweened from Svelte motion. And now we need to turn this current HP value into a store. So we can just say tween and we can say Pokemon HP. And now we need to update values where it's current HP. So I can press Ctrl D and let me just reference it. Value HP. And now we can use the $sign for the store. And then we can say current HP. And let me just make sure when I go here. So for the value, yeah, we can do it like that. So everything that's changed is we use the store. And now when I save this, it's going to restart. But now we're going to have a smooth transition. So let me save it. How awesome is this? This is really beautiful. If you have a countdown or whatever, you can simply use a tween value to get the values in between, right? And this is really awesome. Another thing you can use are springs to add more natural motion to your animations using spring-based physics. So you might be thinking, what's the difference between tween and spring? It's similar to tween, but it generates the value based on some other parameters like stiffness, damping, and etc. from physics. So you get more springy, natural feeling animations. And unfortunately, you can't use spring with Svelte transitions because springs don't have a set duration. But you can control stiffness, damping, transition, and you can create a Svelte action and apply it to your elements. So I have a simple box I want to animate using spring physics, and I'm going to use Svelte actions, which are just regular functions that give us a reference to the element when it's created, because I want to be able to reuse the animation on other elements. So we're going to end up with a springy animation like this. So let's see how we can achieve this. If I go here is nothing special right now. And let me just open this file. So it's motion spring and just a simple component. So let's see how we can add springs. So we can add the spring from Svelte motion. So let me just import the type again. Import type action, because we're going to create an action. Svelte action. And let's create a type spring in. That's what I'm going to call the transition. Spring in params. It's going to have a scale. There's going to be a number. Rotate is also going to be a number. And then just so it's easier to read, I'm going to create this type spring in action. It's just going to take a generic, so you can say it's a HTML element. Take spring in params. And then let's create the action itself. So you can say spring in. We're going to give it spring in action type. You can say node params. And also it doesn't complain, we can just say if there are no params, just return. And now we can destructure the value. So we can say const scale rotate from params. Actually, just make this const value, which we're going to pass to the spring store, right? Then it's going to have a default value rotate 0, scale 1. Then we're going to define the options. So we're going to say, let's see, stiffness 0.1, damping 0.6. Now we can create a spring store. So we can say let transition spring. We're going to pass in the values and the options. And now we're going to subscribe to the store, and we really can't use something like this, like you might be familiar with, because we're basically just in regular JavaScript. And we're going to create the unsubscribe, because now we have to do things by hand, right? So we can say unsubscribe. So we're going to say subscribe, and then we're going to destructure rotate and scale, because we get state back, right? And now we're just back in regular JavaScript. So you can say node style transform, and whenever this updates is going to change these values. So you can say scale. Let's say it's going to be scale like this. And then we're going to give it rotate. Say rotate. Let's close it out. We can say degrees. Close it out like this. And then immediately when this starts, we're going to update it, and that's how I'm going to trigger that transition. So I can say transition update, because that's our store. And again, we get the state back, but we really don't need it. So we can just return scale rotate. Yeah, so now we just need to return a cleanup, because it also returns an update and destroy function. So when this is done, I just want to unsubscribe from the store, which would normally be done for you, right? And now you have Svelte action that you can import from anywhere, and you can just use it on any element. So for example, here I have a box, and now I can say use spring in, and now we can pass it rotate. And since we're using TypeScript, if we don't pass it something, it's going to complain at us. So now we can get auto completion. We can say rotate scale 2. So now when I save it, it should animate. So let's save it, and that's it. So now we can just restart this animation, and look how springy it is. And this is really awesome. It might sound complicated, but at the end of the day, what's more awesome about this isn't some Svelte abstraction. This is just regular JavaScript. And if you're comfortable with JavaScript in Svelte, you can become a complete monster, right? So how awesome is this? So let's talk about how you can use other animation libraries. Using Svelte is enough for most things, but sometimes you need a professional instead of a generalist, and you can reach for an animation library such as Animate.js, GSAP, or Motion One that have features like timelines to coordinate animations, or you want to use some other feature. So far, you've seen how a powerful combination crossfade and flip are in Svelte, but they have their drawbacks, like not working great on elements that are rotated, and flip can be used outside an each block. And that's a shame, because the flip animation technique is mind-blowingly powerful. So for example, let's say I'm working on a card game and want to animate placing cards from your hand to the deck and taking the card back from the deck, but it's not looking great because crossfade doesn't consider the rotation. So here I just have a simple, if I go here, flip Svelte, you can see nothing special. I'm just using crossfade, and then I have some cards. Honestly, the hardest part about this is figuring out the math to make cards like this. So for example, I'm just passing in an index, and then I'm using CSS basically to transform them, even using the Z index. So the first card starts at the top, which is really neat. You can look at it if you want. So basically here is doing some math for the transform. So it's going to get the rotation, then it's going to multiply it by that. Yeah, this really isn't important. What's important here is the crossfade. So for example, I want to add these cards here, and I'm like, okay, I learned about crossfade. This is really going to be awesome. And then this happens, and you're like, what is going on? You're like, and I can even add more cards. And if I return the card back to the hand, it's like complete chaos. And that's because crossfade doesn't really work well using rotations. And there's other problems when it comes to flip animations like nested transforms. And when I say problems, I mean when you implement it yourself, because rotations are evil, okay? But something like GSAP provides a flip plugin that takes care of everything for you. And it just works like magic. So you don't have to implement flip yourself and etc. And this is where we hit the limitations of Svelte, because right now as it is, it doesn't support flip for these use cases. But we can see how simple this is using something like GSAP. So if I go here, I can go to the GSAP example, and right now there's nothing special. We haven't implemented anything, right? So this is how you have a normal card game. You don't really have to think about, oh, when should I use flip and etc. We're just teleporting elements around, and you're going to think, oh, I want to really use an animation for this. How can I do this? And you're like, okay, I can use crossfade, flip, or whatever for this. So let's go to that example. If I go to flip GSAP, and here's the same what I have here. So now we can import GSAP. I already installed it. Import GSAP from GSAP. And then we can import the flip plugin, import flip from GSAP dist flip. And that's how we have to import it. And then we can register the plugin. That's just a GSAP thing. So you can say flip. So remember how we explained what the flip animation technique is. And again, if I go to Excalidraw, and if I remove these things here, we just care that the element is in this position, right? And then it's going to be in the other position. And then whatever we do, we're basically going to take a snapshot of this using something like get bound client rect or whatever. We're going to get these dimensions. And then we're going to do this again when something changes from the transition or whatever state. And then we just need to calculate the difference. And that's basically it, how flip works. So I can close this and I can show you how simple this is. So one method we can do is use before update and after update functions for Svelte. And we can just say, hey, whenever something changes in Svelte, you can do the flip here. But for more control, I'm going to show you how to just create a simple function, which is way easier. So let's just remove this. I have to navigate. And it also did the wrong imports, which is hilarious. I love when it does that. But yeah, basically, so we imported GSAP and we registered the plugin because that's just what you have to do. So here we're going to create the function, the flip function. We're going to say flip. And remember how I told you in the example, what do we first have to do? We have to get the state, so where that element is, and we can do that by flip, get state, and just give it the element it needs to keep track of. And then here we can use tick. So what's going on here, if you're not using tick or request animation frame or even set timeout, it's just going to instantly happen, right? So we need to wait for the next update to the DOM, right? And we can do that using request animation frame. And I prefer this because now I don't have to turn this function into async. And then I need to import tick from Svelte, and then I can use await tick. I just don't want to do this. So let me just remove this. And this is pretty simple. So I can say request animation frame, which takes a callback. And let me just do this. So now what do we do next, right? So we can say flip from, and then we can give it that initial state. This is what GSAP wants. And then again, because we're using a declarative JavaScript framework, the elements are going to get deleted when we reparent them, right? So we need to pass targets to the GSAP plugin. We're going to say, hey, the change happened to card. And then we're going to use a built-in ease from GSAP, really similar how Svelte has it, right? So we can say power 1, in, out, and it's just easings that GSAP has, nothing special. But now nothing is going to happen because we need to give it an ID, so GSAP also knows what updated. So here where the elements are. Yes, before we do that, let's go to the functions. Now we have the GSAP flip thing, right? So now we have to say, hey, whenever something happens, value changes, it changes the position of an element, so we want to flip it, right? So this is what I like about using a function, because this is really obvious that this is what happens. So we can just call it after this, right? And then auto-completion is working against me, but nothing I can't beat, right? So nothing's going to happen yet before we give it the ID. So this is something that GSAP keeps track of, and you know that by reading the documentation. But yeah, we can just say data flip, which is just normal HTML and JavaScript, right? So we can give it the unique ID. In this case, this is card ID. And let's just repeat it for the next one. So this is really similar to how Crossfade also looks for sending and receiving the elements, right? So very similar, but flip on its own, it's very powerful. So we can also say card ID, and now we can save it. This is going to blow your mind if you've never seen a proper flip animation. And how incredible is this? One of the best things about Svelte is the ease of using existing JavaScript libraries because it doesn't require special lifecycle methods to work and makes code reuse easy thanks to actions. So remember the Spring example from before. Let's do the same example using the animation library Motion 1 and Svelte actions. So if I go here, let me just go to the next example. So here is similar to what we had before, nothing is going on here. Let me just open this component. So this is just an actions, we have a box with Animate component, nothing special here. But now I have this file animations, it's just in the same directory. So I just want to show you how you can use actions, and I'm going to deliberately create them in a separate file. So basically this is what you do, right? So I already installed Motion 1, and now we can import Animate in Spring, and we can see how easy it is using Spring in Motion 1. And then I'm again going to import type action from Svelte action. Then let's create the type Spring in params, scale optional, number, rotate, number, type Spring in action. And now we can use the generic HTML element, Spring in params. Let's close it, and now we can create our action, export const Spring in. We can use the type Spring in action, pass it a node, right? Params, and we're just going to use the API for Motion 1. So let me just reiterate, this isn't Svelte, this is the library Motion 1. And Motion 1 gives you this nifty animate function. So you can call animate, and then you can pass it a query selector or whatever, but we already have the node, right? Which we passed in node. We're going to say scale, and then we're going to say, hey, if params isn't available, set it default as 1. And we're going to say the same for rotate, so params, let's just account for it. Say 0, and you can pass in some interesting options here. You can say easing, and look how simple it is in Motion 1. So you can just say here easing, you can say that this is a spring, and boom, that's it, it's done. So we can just save this, and now we can use this action, right, because we exported it. And now if we go here, as I show you in this example, we can just say import Spring in from animations. And now we can use it, right? So we can go here, use Spring in. Let's set the scale to 2, rotate to 90. Now if we go here, let me just save it, and we should see it works. And we can also restart it, and how awesome is this? And of course we have other options. For example, we can say repeat, and we can use infinity. And now it should just repeat, right? But this might be obnoxious, right? And Motion 1 also gives you timeline, same as GSAP, and I think Animate.js also does, and this is really awesome. Another awesome thing about Motion 1 is that it has motion DevTools, which you can use to inspect elements in your browser and even change the animations, which you can play around with, and it's really cool. So let's talk about the last thing, but not the least important, which is accessibility, and arguably the most important one. So if you're using Motion, you have to be responsible because it can make someone sick, and you have to respect their preference for prefers reduced motion. If you open it, you can read more about it on MDN. And basically how you use it in regular CSS is you use this media query prefers reduced motion, and then you can use this. And I also want to emphasize that reduced motion doesn't mean no motion. You just have to adjust the values to something more sensible for those users. But we're using JavaScript to set CSS, right? So how we can do this? Basically, I just have this example here, accessibility. Let me just open it here, accessibility. And I just have this function here to show you in the post. You can take this. The only downside of this is that if the user updates their preference, it won't get updated until the next time they refresh the page. So you can use a Svelte store if you want. But yeah, basically you can just create this. So I'm just using a browser because it's going to run server side. So we're saying, hey, don't do anything, there's no browser, otherwise you're going to get a nasty error. But then once we're in the browser, we can say this is the query, media query list, give back the window match media. And let me just console log this out. So I can say media query list. Let me just open here. Let me just see what's going on. I can just increase the size, turn off responsive view. Yeah, so let's save this and you can see we get back media query list and we get back the matches false, right? And now in your component, you can import this here, prefers reduce motion, get it here. And now you can change your animation values or whatever else you have. And let's quickly fake prefers reduce motion. So I press Control P. Now let's say prefers emulate CSS prefers reduce motion. So remember now we have to restart. And now this should be updated. So it says match is true, prefers reduce motion, yes. So that's how you do that. You should be a proper Svelte animation wizard by now. Congratulations for making it so far. I hope you take what you learned and delight your users, but remember that with great power comes great responsibility. Consider accessibility from the start and remember animations done right are subtle but impactful. Thank you for watching and catch you in the next one.